They say the house is still standing. The boards lean like tired bones, and the chimney, split and moss-covered, still smells faintly of smoke when it rains. Locals avoid it. They cross the dirt road when passing by, muttering a prayer under their breath like their grandparents once did. But what they won't tell you, what they can't tell you, is that once, inside that crooked farmhouse, a man decided to erase the world. His name was Elias Boone. And in the spring of 1909, in the foothills of North Carolina, he locked the doors to his home, and told his children the world outside had ended. People remembered Elias as a man built out of silence. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't laugh, not even at his own wedding. But after his wife died giving birth to their fifth child, something in him fractured in a way no one could see. He began talking about purity. About God's punishment. About how the world was burning in sin. And when the neighbors noticed he'd stopped coming to town altogether, they didn't ask questions. In those days, a man's grief was his own business. It started small. He pulled his children from the church schoolhouse, claiming the teacher was corrupting them with modern ideas. He taught them himself, by firelight, reading only from the Old Testament. Then, a few months later, the family stopped coming to Sunday service entirely. The pastor sent word once, then twice. Elias sent word back, "We worship at home now." That's when people began to whisper. And the whispers have never really stopped. By the end of that year, the Boone family might as well have vanished. Their crops were left to die in the fields. The smoke from their chimney became a rare sight. But every so often, late at night, someone walking the road would swear they saw a flicker of light inside the upper window, a candle, burning long after midnight. One traveler even claimed he heard children's voices reciting scripture, over and over, in perfect unison. They say he ran back to town and never went near that road again. In the years since, historians have tried to make sense of what Elias Boone did inside that house. There are letters, a few journals, and one surviving child's testimony, collected decades later in a state hospital. From those fragments, we can piece together a story that is both too strange and too human to ignore. Elias believed that the outside world had become a prison of lies. He told his children that the devil had taken control of men's tongues, that everyone beyond their land was already marked for destruction. So he built a new world of his own. A smaller one. A cleaner one. Each morning, the children would rise before dawn. They would pray in silence, standing barefoot on the wooden floor until Elias spoke the first word of the day, a verse, always about obedience. Breakfast was plain, cornbread, beans, and water. Then came the lessons. He taught them how to read the scriptures, but only those he approved. Anything else, books, letters, newspapers, was burned in the fireplace behind the house. By the time his oldest son, Silas, turned 13, he had never spoken to another person outside his bloodline. He had never seen the town of Wilkesboro, just 8 miles away. He had never heard music. Imagine that. No sound of a fiddle or a hymn. Only the voice of a father who believed he was saving your soul. The journals describe a strange rhythm to their days, a kind of sacred routine that never broke. Elias would preach at sundown, reading his own sermons from a leather notebook. He told the children the world outside had fallen into chaos after the Great Judgment of 1909, when God had swept the earth clean of sinners. Everything beyond the forest was ash and ruin, he said. And if they ever left, they would burn too. The children believed him. Why wouldn't they? When the wind blew through the trees, Elias told them it was the cries of the damned. When they saw smoke on the horizon, just a neighbor burning brush, he said it was the fires of hell still smoldering in the distance. The Boone children grew up in a pocket of time that never moved forward. The youngest, Ruth, was said to have drawn pictures on the walls in charcoal, images of people without faces, standing outside the house, calling for her to come play. Her father would find them, scrub the walls clean, and make her pray until her knees bled. There are parts of the story that still don't make sense, even now. Records from the 1910 census list Elias Boone as head of household, farmer, widower. 5 children, all alive. But by the time a census taker came again in 1920, the property was abandoned. No graves, no footprints, no records of departure. The land passed to the state in 1924 after unpaid taxes. When a surveyor came to inspect it, he found the farmhouse empty, except for a single book sitting on the table. It was Elias's Bible. Every page after the book of Revelation had been torn out. In their place was a single sheet of paper, written in his hand. The world is reborn. We are waiting for the call. For almost a century, no one has been able to say what happened to the Boone family. Some claim they fled into the hills, joining a lost sect of mountain believers. Others think they died together in that house, perhaps willingly. But the most disturbing theory came from the testimony of a woman admitted to the North Carolina State Hospital in 1938. She gave her name only as R. She said she had once lived in a house with a man who claimed the end of days had come. She said she was one of his daughters. And she said that, one night, he told them it was time to cross over. No bodies were ever found. No death certificates were filed. Just the echo of a name, Boone, passed down through rumor and fear. But buried in the archives of Wilkes County, there's a letter, sealed until 1972, addressed to the sheriff's office. It came from a retired doctor who had treated a child found wandering near the Yadkin River in 1911. The child wouldn't speak, but carried a single wooden carving of a house in her hand. The doctor wrote that she appeared unwashed, malnourished, and completely ignorant of the modern world. The carving matched the Boone farmhouse. And on the back of it, carved into the wood with a knife, were 4 words, small, uneven, but clear. He is still here. The doctor died before he could explain what that meant. But locals say that if you stand by the Boone house on a quiet winter night, you can still hear the echo of a man's voice through the trees. Not shouting, not screaming, just reading, steady and low, as if he's still teaching his children the only lesson he ever knew. That the world outside was never meant for them. And maybe, just maybe, it was never meant for us either. They found her, or what was left of her, miles from where the Boone property once stood. It was 1938, the height of the Depression, and the riverbanks were full of wanderers, men with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. The sheriff thought she was one of them at first, until he saw the way she clutched the wooden carving. The same carving mentioned in the doctor's letter, the one shaped like a house. When they brought her in, she wouldn't speak. Not for days. The nurses said she would sit by the window all night, watching the trees move in the wind, whispering something under her breath. Not a prayer, not a song, something else. A rhythm, a pattern. Like the echo of a language she'd forgotten how to use. When they finally coaxed a name from her lips, it wasn't Boone. It was Ruth. The girl from the farmhouse. The youngest child. She was 30 years old. Ruth Boone's file still exists, part of the state hospital archives. It's a thin folder, just a few pages. But the details are enough to raise a chill that doesn't fade easily. She spoke of the waiting, of the cross, and of the voice that does not sleep. She said her father had promised them a new world, one where no one could ever hurt them again. But before they could go, they had to shed that shell of flesh. The doctors wrote it off as religious delusion. But one psychiatrist, Dr. James Leary, wasn't so sure. He said Ruth showed signs of trauma too coherent to be fantasy. She spoke in vivid detail about the house, the rituals, the sound of the church bells her father made them ring at midnight. But there were no church bells. There never had been. Leary's notes include one final entry, dated April 12, 1939. It reads: Patient claims her father did not die. Claims he walks the forest. Says she still hears him calling the others. She asks to be locked in her room at night. Says it keeps him away. After that, there are no more notes. Ruth Boone died the following year, cause listed as self-inflicted injury. What the hospital didn't record was the detail found by the night nurse. Ruth had scratched a word into the wooden windowsill with her fingernails. Over and over, until her fingers bled. The word was, listen. And now, all these decades later, that's what we're doing, listening. Listening for what she heard, and trying to understand what made a man erase the world and rebuild it inside his own mind. The deeper you look into Elias Boone's story, the more it becomes clear that his isolation wasn't sudden. There are older accounts, barely legible letters in family archives, that show signs of obsession years before the tragedy. Elias's father, Thomas Boone, served in the Civil War. He wrote about the loss of faith, about men who saw God in the smoke of battle and never found him again. Thomas returned home with a wound that wouldn't heal and a voice that trembled when he prayed. Elias grew up watching a man whisper psalms into the dirt, pleading for forgiveness no one could grant. So maybe what happened in 1909 wasn't madness that came out of nowhere. Maybe it was something inherited, a seed of despair passed down from father to son, until it took root deep enough to choke an entire family. One local legend speaks of the Boone sermon. They say it was a final gathering Elias held, the night before he vanished. 5 children kneeling. A father at the pulpit of his own making. Candles burning low. No one outside ever saw it, but neighbors claimed they heard a sound that night, something between a hymn and a scream. And when the sun rose, the house was quiet. What no one knew then is that Elias left behind more than just a Bible. In 1965, a group of students from Appalachian State visited the property, studying rural architecture. They found a false wall behind the fireplace. Hidden inside were several pages, written in the same tight, angular handwriting as the note found on the table decades before. The pages weren't sermons, they were instructions. He called them the rebirth lessons. Each page described steps for the preservation of purity. It spoke of fasting, silence, and obedience. But near the end, the language changes. He begins writing about the second sun, about a light that will burn away the false flesh. Some historians interpret it as apocalyptic symbolism. But one line stands out even today, as if Elias had written it not for his children, but for anyone who might one day find his words. If you have heard the calling voice, it means you were meant to remember. Do not forget that he still walks among us, teaching the lost. The lost. That word appears again and again in everything he wrote. The lost world, the lost people, the lost tongue. But the most chilling part? When Ruth was institutionalized, she used the same phrase in her interviews, decades later. The lost. She said her father was teaching them how to prepare for the return. The investigators thought it was coincidence. But you and I know better. Because how could a child, kept isolated for years, locked away from the world, grow up and repeat the same language, verbatim, 30 years later? Unless, of course, she was still hearing him. Elias Boone didn't just imprison his children physically. He rewired the way they thought, the way they saw themselves, the way they believed the world worked. It wasn't a cult. It was something worse, a family turned into a mirror that reflected only one man's vision of God. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo of his words, not in the wind or the trees, but in the way we talk about family, faith, and obedience even now. Because this isn't just a ghost story from 1909. It's an old American sickness. The kind that hides behind closed doors and calls itself virtue. The kind that builds walls out of righteousness and names them protection. Elias Boone's story is a wound in the soil of the Carolinas, a quiet infection that seeps through time. And every so often, it bleeds again, through stories of families cut off from the world, of children who disappear, of voices that whisper about salvation in the dark. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run? Would you have believed? Or would you have listened, just once, to the voice that said stay inside? Because that's how it starts. Not with a lock on a door, or a man with a Bible, but with an idea. The idea that the world outside is dangerous. That only we know the truth. That purity can be preserved if we just cut away enough of the world. That's what Elias believed. And maybe that's why the story of the Boone family still feels familiar. Because the moment we think we're safe from corruption, that's the moment it finds us again. In whispers. In scripture. In the sound of the wind against the window of a house that should have fallen long ago. And maybe, it never really left. That there's a story people in Wilkes County still tell, quietly, and only when the night feels heavy. They say that during the floods of 1940, when the Yadkin River rose high enough to wash away whole bridges, a body was found lodged between the roots of an old oak near the Boone property. It was never officially identified. Male, mid-60s, bones showing signs of long malnutrition. What unsettled the coroner wasn't the death itself, it was the condition of the hands. The nails were worn down to nothing. The skin was rough, flayed, as if he'd been clawing through dirt. In his pocket, they found a folded scrap of paper. The words on it read, "We are awake. He has returned." The handwriting matched Elias Boone's. The sheriff buried the remains without ceremony. No one claimed them. The case was forgotten, another casualty of poverty and the wild storms that reshaped the hills that year. But it's hard to ignore the timing. The body surfaced just months after Ruth Boone's death. It's as if the past waited until both father and daughter were gone before letting go of what it had been holding beneath the mud. That's where most records end. But in the decades that followed, strange echoes kept surfacing in the foothills. People spoke of the silent ones, families who lived deep in the forest, building cabins without windows, raising children who didn't go to school, who spoke in strange, old-fashioned tongues. Lawmen would investigate, find nothing, and write it off as mountain superstition. But the locals knew the name Boone too well to ignore it. Some said the bloodline continued, that Elias's sons carried his teachings into the hills, keeping the rebirth lessons alive. Others believed the man in the river was no patriarch at all, but a follower who tried to carry on the doctrine and failed. Either way, something spread. Quietly. Patiently. Like rot in the roots of an old tree. In 1971, a fire broke out near the site of the Boone farmhouse. The flames moved slow but deliberate, as if drawn to the shape of the old foundation. When firefighters arrived, they found a cellar entrance uncovered by the heat, something no one had known existed. Inside were shelves, lined with jars of preserved food long turned black, a child's shoe, and a set of wooden carvings, 6 in total. 5 were small. 1 was large. Each carving showed the same image, a house surrounded by trees, and inside, 5 figures kneeling before a man. The last carving, the largest, was unfinished. The wood around the man's face had been gouged away, leaving only a hollow space where his features should have been. They closed the site for safety, but the firefighters who found it said something they shouldn't have. They said when they lifted the carvings, the cellar felt cold, cold enough that their breath showed white in the beam of their lanterns, though it was midsummer. And one man swore that as he climbed back into the night air, he heard footsteps behind him. Not echoes. Footsteps. The house burned to the ground that night. But fire doesn't destroy everything. It only hides what we don't want to see. Years later, a folklorist named Samuel Irons came across the Boone case while collecting oral histories in the region. He tracked down surviving relatives, cousins, in-laws, anyone with the name. What he found was a pattern of silence. Entire branches of the family that refused to speak about their ancestry. One descendant, living in Asheville, told him, "We don't use that name anymore. We changed it in '42. My father said the Boones were marked." When Irons asked what he meant, the man just said, "Some blood carries more than memory." The folklorist published his notes in a small university journal. But there was one passage that never made it to print, found only in his private correspondence. He wrote that while visiting the ruins of the Boone property, he found something that unsettled him beyond explanation, a small ring of stones behind what used to be the house, each one carved with initials. He copied them into his notebook. EB, RB, SB, and 2 others worn away by time. 5 in total. And in the center of the circle, pressed deep into the dirt, was the outline of a 6th stone, missing. Irons never returned to the site. His colleague said he abandoned the Boone project entirely. A year later, he disappeared while driving through the Blue Ridge Parkway. His car was found empty, the driver's door open, engine still running. Inside, police found his notebook. The last line he wrote read simply, "The 6th has been found." It's tempting to call all of this coincidence, old folklore tangled with fear and grief. But the Boone story doesn't behave like legend. It keeps resurfacing, like something trying to remember itself. Every few decades, someone hears a voice, sees a light, dreams of a man teaching children beneath the trees. They wake up unable to explain why the name Elias Boone sits heavy on their tongue. Maybe that's what Ruth meant by "listen." Maybe it wasn't a warning. Maybe it was an invitation. And if the story feels familiar, it's because it's older than Elias Boone, older than North Carolina itself. It's the story of control, of one voice deciding who gets to see the light and who must stay in darkness. It's the story of every father who thinks he can protect his children from the world by remaking it in his own image. And it's the story of how belief, once twisted, becomes a cage that doesn't need walls to hold you in. When you strip away the ghosts and the rumors, what's left is a question. One that has haunted this land long before Elias shut the doors of his farmhouse. How much of what we call faith is really fear? And when fear takes root, how many generations does it take to dig it out? They say that on cold nights, the Boone land still hums, like the echo of a prayer that never stopped. Some call it wind. Some call it madness. But if you ever find yourself there, standing among the ruins, and you hear a man's voice reading softly through the trees, don't listen too long. Because history has a way of repeating the words it was never meant to keep. And the voice that speaks them, might be waiting for someone to answer. This has been Eyes of the Past. Until next time, keep your ears open. And whatever you do, don't go looking for the Boone house.